what we're going to talk about today is the part of the Atawhai project that I had something to do with, which was the exit interviews. So Atawhai, for those of you who aren't quite sure, and I took this from Claire's kōrero, so if it's wrong, aroha mai, that's my misinterpretation of it. But Atawhai was research-led relational response to family violence that was developed in partnership with primary care professionals here in Te Moana Toi, Bay of Plenty, grounded in the Kaupapa Māori principles and informed by complexity theory, which we'll get into further along in my kōrero. But it involved a series of wānanga and supported participants to explore and reflect on how system level change happens in practice. So it was really investigating how violence and domestic violence appears to practitioners and what tools they have to deal with it. The kupu Atawhai has many meanings in te reo Māori. That's the beauty of our language. But for this project, it speaks to moving gently with care and kindness. So I extended that to the title of today's kōrero, Atawhaitia te mātauranga, to reflect how we approach the exit interviews that I'll be talking about today. The interviews were undertaken with deliberate care, guided by relationship and grounded in manaaki, and this allowed participants to reflect on their own journeys through Atawhai and share the stories of change in a way that honoured both them and the kaupapa. So the Atawhai team had a couple of ways to measure the change within the project, but they didn't initially include exit interviews. But as they were travelling through, it became clear that something else was needed to capture the participants' experience, because the project was a 3-year project. And the qualitative interviews offered participants a chance to reflect on their personal and collective journeys of change. And that's where I was brought in. So this is where I entered towards the tail end of the project. I wasn't part of the Atawhai team, but I have worked with members of the Atawhai team in a number of capacities in my other roles. I'm a collective member, as Claire said, of Tauranga Women's Refuge, and I've worked previously in Hauora across the Bay of Plenty. I was at Poutere Trust for a little bit, and I've got a legal background, so I practiced as a lawyer for about 7 years here in Tauranga Moana. So I had enough independence from the project to hold space for reflection, but I had enough knowledge of the kaupapa to be able to have a conversation with the participants as we moved through. So Elizabeth has talked about the complexity theory that she champions, and she is one of the professionals and she's the go-to person around complexity theory. And that's one of the systems that informs the Atawhai project. The other one is Te Ao Māori, and that's a photo of my marae back home in Wairoa. That's Taiho marae. And for me, Kaupapa Māori as a theory, I didn't have any knowledge of before I really started working in research. I didn't know that there was this theory or framework called Kaupapa Māori because I never had to use it. I was lucky enough to be born in Wairoa and raised by my people at my marae, and so all I knew was when people talk to me about Kaupapa Māori, that's my lived experience. That's how I live. I didn't know that there was an explanation about it out there in the academic world. So for me, tapping into the Te Ao Māori part of it was easy. Whakawhitiwhiti kōrero, having a discussion, whakawhanaungatanga, whakapapa, making those relationship connections was something that I'm naturally inclined to do. But when it came to the complexity and systems change part of the kaupapa, that's where I really had to dig in, lean on Claire and try to figure out what this complexity change kōrero was. So I'm not the expert on complexity change, and I feel like if I'm going to try and explain it here, I'm going to lose people because I don't have that really based knowledge on it. But broadly, what I've been able to figure out so far in my work with Elizabeth and Claire in the complexity and systems change frameworks is that it looks at everything in the complex system. So it looks at the whole and it looks at every bit of the whole and tries to figure out how they all interact together. And it understands that change doesn't follow a tidy path. It emerges through interactions between people, issues, and context. So it's just describing the world as it truly operates, really. No matter the frameworks that we want to put around it and the boxes that we want to put everything in, that's not how the world operates. And for issues such as domestic violence and for systems such as a health system, that is truly not linear, not simple. And so complexity change helps us navigate how those systems and this kaupapa of domestic violence intersect. And it also helped identify that for a proper evaluation of what happened during the Atawhai journey, something like the exit interviews needed to happen. And so I'll just move to what happened during the interviews and the actual process that we went through. I managed to conduct 7 interviews with participants, 6 participants and 1 national collective member. Is that the name, Claire, of the advisory group? I had already had an existing relationship with 2 of those participants that I had worked closely with previous to this kōrero, but I had never met the remaining 5 through the Kaupapa Māori framework or how we were able to operate there. I was able to quickly establish a reciprocal collegial relationship with most of them really quickly. And actually within 5 minutes of talking to one, I was able to make a whakapapa connection, which happens to be a marae connection. So, you know, through that, it opens up the dialogue really quickly, and you can just get into the depth of the kōrero really fast. We did have a question guide. We had prepared a set of questions and a set of themes that we wanted to explore with our participants, but it wasn't formulaic, and it wasn't something that I followed probably as strictly as a traditional researcher may have, which helped in this. I'm not sure if it's helpful all the time, but it did help in that I just steered the conversation if I needed to. But the reality was that the kōrero was just flowing so naturally, because what I found with the participants were so invested in the kaupapa that they could speak about it for days. So they had given a lot of their own life to being part of this kaupapa, and that was really reflected in how the kōrero was able to flow with most of them, and what we were able to talk about within that space. People were able to talk about everything from the general kaupapa of Atawhai and what it meant and what their hopes and aspirations were for it, through to the nitty-gritty of actually having to, the challenges they faced, the barriers they faced, the frustrations they had, and their concerns about the current state of how domestic violence is viewed and treated within the health system. I'll go to what we learned. So after capturing all of the kōrero, we came together as a team and we used the Atawhai methodology of Māori and the complexity lens to analyse the data as a group through a full day hui in March and a follow-up hui in April. So this is last year, 2024. We were already in July 2025, but this is last year. And it helped us identify 7 key themes. So we were able to identify that the te tiriti relationship, which is one of the core foundational values of Atawhai, was really important, and it helped establish strong, trusting relationships. And those relationships, the strength of those relationships, were foundational to progressing the kaupapa for the participants. It also gave people a chance to talk about issues that you don't really talk about in these spaces, like colonisation and racism. Those conversations were able to be had in a softer way than people may be able to have them today under the current government that we have at the moment, when it's where it can be quite hard because it's quite confrontational. The Atawhai rōpū were able to have those conversations together as tangata tiriti and tangata whenua. Another theme that came through was tika pono and aroha nui. Those were core principles of Atawhai, and they guided the journey, and they kept everybody pono to what was happening. They're good pau to have to bring everyone back together. Aroha kept everybody engaged because a lot of the participants spoke about how difficult it became to get to the wānanga every month, and all the barriers, the practical barriers of attending. You get busy at work, other priorities compete for your time and attention, but it was the aroha for the kaupapa that kept them coming back. Tika to turn up correctly, created space for voicing discomfort, because you had to be able to be yourself in these conversations. And so if you were feeling some amu, you were able to voice that discomfort. And being pono, that reminded everybody that everyone is on this journey of learning throughout this kaupapa and this project. Relational research, the research methodology was interesting to talk about. A lot of people were quite, the reflection was at the end that they understood it, they got it. But the journey to get there was quite a journey. People didn't understand, some of the participants didn't understand what they were doing, and they wanted a set framework, and that's not the way that it had been delivered and constructed. So there was a little bit of uncertainty and uncomfortableness at the beginning. By the time I talked to them at the end of the project, they understood and they got it, and they loved that it happened that way. But I think there was some uncomfortableness in the middle of the project when they were going through it. But once it landed, ka taka te kapa, they understood what was happening. And then that ties into the next one, the kare aroto, your emotional shifts. Again, like I've said, people felt deeply connected to the kaupapa. Some described feeling proud, others experienced frustration, navigating organisational hierarchies, system barriers that were in place. But through it all, everyone identified that it was the other participants that got them through the frustrations. It was that collectivity that held them in good stead for the kaupapa. The other 3 things that we were able to pull through is what a lot of challenging in how the problem is understood, because you had people who worked in GPs, you had nurses, you had hauora providers, social workers, and so how participants viewed family violence was very different depending on their lived experience and also their professional experience. Through kōrero with each other, they learned new languages and ways of thinking, and this built confidence and trust, and also revealed how traditional systems can block change when they put you into these boxes or into a certain way of thinking that can actually prevent you from actually dealing with the problem in a way that helps the person going through the violence or experiencing the violence, or people using violence. Especially, well, I have some quotes up on the next slide, but there were some people who it took them going through this project to understand, actually, it's not for me to fix the problem. I'm only here as a support. I'm here to support, and that's all right. That is fine. They had to let go of some of the ownership of being the fixer, being the solution. Another big theme was organisations and professions. I've touched briefly on it, but organisations and professions sometimes get in the way of being able to provide a true response to whānau violence for our whānau, for our participants who were working with families. People changed, but organisations didn't always follow. Job roles, leadership gaps, systemic priorities sometimes got in the way. Political shifts, also funding requirements, funding vehicles, they all influence how an organisation has to move through certain phases, which doesn't always align with what people are needing from the professionals in front of them at the time. And it became clear within the journey that for some original participants, Atawhai wasn't a good fit. In other cases, it came down to whether a leader in the organisation backed a kaupapa or not, regardless of the support the kaimahi had for the project. And our final theme was ahuru mōwai, and that the wānanga provides safety for the participants. They were spaces where people could talk honestly about family violence and allowed people to understand the issue more deeply, feel less isolated, and build confidence in their own practice. So these are just some of the quotes from some of our participants. And I picked some nice ones just because we're ending on it. But there were a lot of learnings from these interviews. And I think one of the biggest things is that it became really clear that the journey to change is not a linear one. It sort of goes up and down, and it's always evolving. And sometimes it can be really hard when you're going through the change. But at the end by the time I talked to the participants, they were all really, really proud that they had participated in this journey, that they were part of this project, and that the changes that they could see themselves in their own practices and the support that they had from the wider network were really key elements of how they operated and were able to make changes within their own practice. So e kouautira, thank you for listening to my little ramble this morning. And yeah, any pātai mai.
Kia ora, Carey. Awesome presentation.